Good afternoon, everyone. And good afternoon, everyone. Even in the back of the room, we're going to start our presentation. I'm Pamela Dellal, the director of the Bach Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to our penultimate presentation, which is a discussion of the Mass in G major, which we will be presenting in the church service tomorrow morning. And then the final event of the Bach Institute 2026 is the showcase concert, 7 p.m. in the sanctuary, featuring all of the hard work and all the music that our fellows have been preparing this entire week. So today, myself with my associate director of the Institute and artistic director of Emmanuel Music, Ryan Turner, we're going to have a conversation about this fascinating piece, the Mass. And with that, I'm going to sit down for the rest of the presentation. And I'm going to start by sort of laying out what we know, what we don't know, and the speculations that arise from lack of knowledge. So the Mass in G major is assumed to have been composed between 1738 and 1739. But one of the reasons that it's ambiguous is there is no record at all of a performance of the work. So we have obviously an extant score. But these four masses that Bach wrote in this later half of 1730s, only one of them has a date that it was performed in Leipzig. So it opens up a number of questions, the first one of which is, why did he write them, right? And as I pointed out, whenever there is lack of definitive knowledge, speculation starts to enter. I was thinking over the week, it's been such a fascinating week, all of our conversations about parody, and I thought if there was one word that seems to have come up almost as often as the word parody, it's the word speculation. So one aspect of Bach writing these masses in Latin that is worth saying is that it's not quite as unusual as you might think if you associate the Latin Mass only with a Catholic rite, because in the Lutheran service, the Latin words were being performed, but generally in a simple chant structure. There had been a tradition of Kyrie Gloria being concerted, in other words, written in sort of modern music. But the latter half of the Mass ordinary, the Credo, the Sanctus, Benedictus, Agnus Dei, etc., generally not. In fact, some of you may know that Bach's first attempt in this form is the Kyrie Gloria that later became the B minor Mass. And this piece has a very interesting history. He wrote it in 1733, and it was first performed in Dresden, where it seems pretty clear that he was sort of angling for a position. So it was sort of an audition piece, really. And if you heard our rehearsal this morning, you would immediately realize that these pieces are not as ambitious as that B minor. There are fewer movements, you know, Kyrie, Christe, Kyrie, all in one movement, whereas in the B minor Mass, that is three separate movements. And the splitting out of various different sections in the Gloria as well, much more elaborate in that earlier work. So we can maybe put aside a theory that these other Latin Masses are also audition pieces. There's not clear evidence that Bach at this point was in contact with some kind of Catholic court that he might have been looking to move to, so I don't believe that we can regard these works that way. My speculation, I will talk a little later about where I get the right to speculate, but my speculation is that he was really excited and intrigued by setting the Latin words when he created the B minor. And I think it gave him ideas about liberating the music a bit from the very specific German text that he'd been setting, allowing the somewhat more abstract Latin text to free up the sort of message of the music itself. And as Ryan will show us, he makes extensive changes to the pieces that he draws on. Another thing that I think is really magnificent is that the pieces that he uses to rework for this G major mass and also the other three come from one of his most highly creative periods. So 3 of these cantatas, 179, not 79, 79 is a later work, but 138, yeah. 179 and 138 are both from his first year in Leipzig, where he was filled with creative energy, and it just seems like he felt like this was where he wanted to be. He wanted to be in a place where he could be creating liturgical cantatas every week, and there's this sort of young man's energy. And now he's coming back to these works with, I think, a lot of affection and a lot of a sense that there's so much that these pieces had to say, and it would be great to kind of figure out what else they can say. 79 is a slightly later work. It comes from his third cycle of cantatas, but I think still there's that feeling that he's extremely proud of this music, and freeing it up from its original text gives it his opportunity to interrogate the music and see how it might shift in its meaning.
Good afternoon. What I'd like to do is walk us through the six movements of the cantata and demonstrate the transformation from the original cantata to what the changes Bach made, and play musical examples of each of them so that you can hear how this transformation happens. So we start with the opening movement, the Kyrie, which it comes originally from Bach Cantata 179, which is Siehe zu, dass deiner Gottesfurcht nicht Heuchelei sei, which is warns us about hypocrisy and having a false heart. The opening movement has 2 different motives, and one of them is quite warm and tantalizing. It kind of makes you makes hypocrisy attractive. And the second one is a little bit more chromatic and harrowing when it talks about the false heart. One of the sort of musical brilliant things that Bach does is he creates a double fugue with invertible counterpoint. What do I mean by that? The opening, etc. That fugue subject, flipped upside down, is then sung by the tenors up a fifth. So we have these mirror images of each other in the counterpoint, and he does that throughout the entire movement until he presents a second motive, bum, 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 and it goes throughout. I'm going to play for you the original, the Cantata 79 version, have you hear that, and then I'm going to talk about how Bach changes it for the Kyrie of this G major Mass. So this is the opening movement of Cantata 79, Siehe zu, dass deine Gottesfurcht nicht Heuchelei. So one of the things I want to point out to you is in this opening motive, Bach writes a trill in the fifth bar, sixth bar. So, on the word heuchelei, which is hypocrite. And it has this sort of tantalizing, this sort of veneer of what a hypocrite gives you. In the Kyrie of this G major Mass, a few things happen. Number one, there's no trill. And I've heard recordings where they do a trill. I particularly don't like the trill because I think he's smoothing things out. Also, all the chromaticism in the Kyrie is sort of smoothed out in a way. The edges are rounded out. And the chromaticism, instead of being so sort of spiky, is more leading in places. The other thing he does is we typically think of a Kyrie and a Christe as being a three ABA form. Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison, Kyrie eleison. Which I should hold this microphone up, whoops. I saw Seth looking at me. But in this case, he presents the opening Kyrie motive, and then we get Christe ele, which is the final motive we just heard there. But then he layers them on top of each other. So we have the Kyrie and the Christe coexisting, which is not typical in the form.
In fact, I noticed that one of the scholars that wrote on this piece said that it used to be believed that Mozart was the first composer who mingled Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison in the Requiem. If you know the Requiem, you'll remember that the sort of second subject of the fugue, Christe, but in fact, he pointed out in this piece, Bach is already doing it.
And I think it's interesting that when it happens in the Cantata 79, there's this sense of these two things coexisting in the duplicity of hypocrisy, and he transforms it to the duplicity of the Kyrie and the Christe in one.
I may be jumping on something you wanted to point out, but I was absolutely stunned and arrested this morning when I realized that the very first note of the piece is a cappella, which is not the way it is in the Cantata 179, where we have a very firm low G that kicks it off. And immediately right away, it makes it sound like a Renaissance motet. The fact that the voices begin, I don't think there's any other instance in a Bach cantato where singers begin before instruments do. So that was striking. But I also was realizing that this is where we get into this whole idea of how do parody works relate to their originals. And I had come to this sort of metaphor that they sort of, they shine with a double light, that you see both messages sort of present at the same time, especially if you know the context. Kyrie eleison is a statement of penitence, and it's sort of an opening statement of turning to God, right? It's a strong message about faith. And of course, the cantata is talking about faith. It's talking about your faith must be free from hypocrisy. You must not serve God with a false heart, right? And therefore, this ambiguity that floats throughout the Mass, the first movement of the Mass, are we being warned, or are we finding in our expression of devotion to God and to Christ, should we be on the lookout, or is it somehow creeping in? The less than pure faith that might be tainted with the hypocrisy that's left over from the cantata.
So I'm going to play, although most of you heard it, I think it's just helpful to hear them back to back. And there was something else. Oh, if we think about, you mentioned that in 1733 he put together the Gloria, Kyrie and Gloria, which then becomes part of the B minor Mass. But this movement has always reminded me to some degree of the second Kyrie in the B minor Mass. It's in that same stile antico style, almost Palestrina-esque in terms of that Renaissance motet style. And we also know during this period, in the 1730s, Bach was performing at times Palestrina Masses in the Thomaskirche. So this is the actual Kyrie that you heard. So I think of all the pieces, this is the one that the transformation is, they're in some ways the most similar. And we go on to the Gloria, which I find absolutely fascinating what he does in this one. This comes from Cantata 79, which was a Reformation cantata that was in his third Jahrgang, or third year in Leipzig. And it has a very unique instrumentation in that it is two horns, in which, that's not interesting, but they're two high horns in G with timpani and then a string complement and two oboes. Later on, he added two flutes to it in a later version, but we're focused on this version right now. And the text is, Gott der Herr ist Sonne und Schild. The Lord God is a sun and shield. And you'll hear in this opening, there are essentially two themes. There's this very festive marching theme from the horns and the timpani. And you hear in the timpani, pop, 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 this sort of incessant, almost pounding. And I think it's hard not to think that this is Bach's image of Martin Luther taking those 95 Theses and hammering to the castle church door in Wittenberg from 1517 during the Protestant Reformation, this pop, 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 pop. And then the second one you hear is it's a counter melody to this that it starts out that way, and it just kind of is scattered and sparkling about the whole thing. And yet there's this sort of almost martial, marching aspect to the opening of this. So take a listen to this and then we'll play its counterpart. There you get the idea, and it's this very long instrumental ritornello that begins this thing. The way Bach transformed this for the Gloria is, to me, just a stroke of genius, that these horns are transformed into angels in the opening. And this, essentially taking this sort of earthly battle up to the clouds, where the angels here are almost like, they're there to announce the birth of the child. And when the full chorus finally comes in, there's this almost organ-like quality to the Et in terra pax. And at the same time, the is present, sort of almost subterranean on earth in the strings, and this figure gets tossed about. And then we get to the Laudamus, which, if you were in the rehearsal, you heard, it is a busy, complex, chaotic affair. It is, I see it as this sort of cacophonous, ecstatic exclamation of praise. Laudamus te, we praise you, our Lord. And it just is, you can feel it like bouncing around the space is the idea of this. So I want you to hear, the other thing is, so the Gloria begins without any instrumental ritornello, which is what they did in Cantata 79. It just starts headlong with the sopranos and altos in this angelic way. And there's no timpani. The timpani are gone. and then that motive comes in. So by one simple change of turning the horns into sopranos and altos, I think the whole character of this is transformed into something that is far more ebullient and airborne for the Gloria. You wanted to add something?
Well, I was just going to point out that when in the original cantata, after that very long, very glorious ritornello, when the voices finally come in and they say, Gott der Herr ist Sonn und Schild, God the Lord is our sun and our shield. It's this sort of huge stentorian proclamation, and he saves that all the way, right, until I can't remember where in the Mass he finally gets to that texture, but he doesn't hit us with it right away. Sort of he's building up to it, so that that sense of finally arriving on the humanity, giving the praise back to God, is sort of the culmination as opposed to the opening of the piece.
And I'll also add one thing, that I think the way that the Kyrie and the Gloria are connected to each other, even though these are two cantatas that were written 2 years apart for different Sundays of the church year, not at all related, is that Bach, in a tonal way, uses a Mixolydian mode, which has a lowered seventh scale degree. Kyrie. It goes down. We're expecting so there'd be a leading tone in G major, but instead and in the Gloria, we hear that every time there's adoramos, the adoring harkens back to that, and the sopranos always sing G down to F natural, even though it's in a G major mode. So I think there is some intentionality in his choices of pieces that he links together in this Kyrie Gloria movement. Moving on to the third movement, which is the Gratias. It began its life in 1723 as a bass aria in the midst of an incredibly experimental cantata. Cantata 138, which is Warum betrübst du dich, mein Herz? Why do you trouble yourself, my heart? This was written in September of 1723, and it was his first big experiment, I would say, with how do we interpolate recitatives within chorales, and this sort of these. What's an aria? What's arioso? He was really playing around with forms and trying to blur the lines, as it were. And in the midst of this experiment in this cantata, all of a sudden comes this bass aria, which almost feels out of place because it's in this minuet dance, almost a galant style. It's very accessible, is what I would say, in the midst of a cantata full of thorny experimentation. I can only imagine what Bach's congregation thought hearing that cantata, and when the bass aria comes up, the text is, my confidence is in God, and there's a real sense like a sturdiness and a feeling of like, oh, we finally arrived at something familiar.
I was just going to point out that our founder, Craig Smith, writes very interestingly about this piece, and he finds that the bass aria is less than convincing, I think for the same reason that it seems out of place. It's long and elaborate, but I hate to use this word, but somewhat predictable in its melodic and its sort of structural form. That I think there is a sense, and I'm not now speaking for Craig, but sort of a concession to expectations of the listener at this point. It's like they really need to hear something that's highly melodic and very ordered. And of course, the text drives you to that. God is my confidence. I put my trust in God. So I'll just say, I have the microphone on, that it seems like that piece maybe was calling to Bach. I maybe didn't put it in the right place in the first time. This piece needs another home.
So I'm going to just play a brief bit of the how it happens in the cantata. And you'll see they're nearly identical settings in terms of what's happening musically. There are minor changes that he makes, but it's the text that changes. But here's the original. The opening instrumental ritornello is completely the same, unchanged note for note. So I'm going to jump to when the voice comes in. Where we just stopped, you hear in the continual line, again, a motivic idea that we hear in the Gloria, and it's this Albert Schweitzer, the Bach scholar, called that Bach's joy motive, the little 2/16 followed by an eighth, throughout. It is this sort of ever-present little bubbling about that happens. Now we hear almost the exact same material, but with different text in the Gratias. I won't play this whole opening because it's exactly the same, and here's when the voice comes in. So the first thing he does to change this, in the opening, it was, in the original cantata movement, bum, is what the voice does. In the Gratias, we get this arpeggiated feeling. There's like almost outpouring of gratitude, which I think really changes the trajectory of the line because it feels like the bass is in motion as opposed to these sort of just granite-like quarter notes that are in the other one that are declaiming my confidence is in God. Anything you wanted to add to that? We go on to the fourth movement, the Domine Deus, which takes us back to our Reformation cantata, Cantata 79, the Mein Gott ist Sonne und Schild. And what's interesting about this one is that the original is a soprano bass duet. In the Mass, it's transformed to a soprano alto duet. In the cantata, it begins without any introduction. It comes right out of a recitative. There are examples of this in Bach, but I think they're few and far between where a duet or an aria or a vocal movement begins without any introduction, coming directly out of a recitative. The other big change that happens is in the violin figuration, the violin ritornello, which is much more sort of driving and penetrating in a way, and we get these big octave leaps. And in the Mass, a lot of that stuff is smoothed out. So let's hear a little bit of this, the example from the soprano bass duet in the actual cantata. You hear the octave. Deep, deep, deep.
This, I've always found this movement quite striking, and it's very appropriate in a Reformation cantata. What we get with Martin Luther, if you know the great Cantata 80, which is the great Reformation cantata, you see the same language. First of all, this sort of celebration of faith, and then immediately we're surrounded by enemies, right? Whether the enemy is Satan, which of course in Ein Festeburg, he's present immediately in the chorale, but also who else is the enemy of the Lutherans? The Pope, right? The Catholics, the people in the neighboring regions. So in Cantata 79, this piece is filled with paranoia. And I think that the spikiness of the violin writing, there's this sense of sort of hunkering down, and he said, the text says, don't ever abandon your own. Remember us, right? And even though the enemies are raging against us, obgleich sehr wider uns die Feinde toben, right? So I think that sometimes we don't really want to feel that very dark energy, that sense of us against them, but it's kind of hard to avoid that in a lot of Bach pieces, and particularly in the Reformation pieces, because this is so much Martin Luther's message. So I found it fascinating that he turned to this movement, and in this section of the Mass, you know, if you're only setting a Kyrie and Gloria, you find the words miserere nobis in this section of the Gloria. We often think of that sentiment of have mercy on us as belonging to the Agnus Dei at the very end of the Mass. And if Bach was a decade earlier, away from deciding how he was going to set Agnus Dei, right? He hadn't written that part of the B minor Mass yet. So for him, having this darker, more supplicating text, hear our prayer, have mercy on us, I'm imagining that he was thinking back to pieces that had that sense of really needing assistance, right? Which is what we can glean from the original.
So when we get to the Domine Deus from the Mass in G major, we go from soprano bass to soprano alto. And I think that's intentional, and we see this also in the B minor Mass, the soprano alto duets that are moving in these thirds, which was a popular thing in the opera houses in Dresden at the time. He's appealing, I feel in this piece, he's appealing to a broader audience outside of Leipzig in the Dresden court. And it's bringing these two voices closer together in approximation and range gives it a completely different sound than the distance between the soprano and the bass. He also adds to it a brief 4-bar figure in the continuo, so it doesn't start without introduction like it did in the cantata. And as you'll hear in this violin ritornello, it's interesting you bring up the idea of the Agnus Dei, because even though it's in a completely different key, there are things about it, the chromaticism in it, these little sighing motives that we get at times that make me think of what was to become, or what was, another parody, Ach bleibe doch, that he'd already written, or was about to write, I should say, because he hadn't written the Ascension cantata yet.
And again, it's such a wonderful thing, no matter how much you might study a piece or listen to recordings, to hear it unfolding in a rehearsal. Because as I was listening to the duet just now, I realized that the chromaticism in the violin part, which is different than what it was in the cantata, harkens back to the first movement, harkens back to some of that slippery, surprising turns of notes. And so the integration of this work across its movements is something that often gets overlooked because we're so busy looking back in the past to the original form of each individual movement.
And one other similar thing to that is that we go back to the soprano and alto now as solo voices, but in thirds. The same way they began the second movement, they were horns transformed into these angelic figure moving in thirds, and now we get the same thing again. We've talked a lot in between. I'm going to play just the opening of the cantata bit again, so you hear that, and then I'll go right into the Kyrie, the Mass movement, so you hear the difference. And now the Domine Deus. Slower tempo. Somewhat.
Domine Deus Agnus Dei.
won't go on, but there's a next section of this movement, the Filius Patris, the Son of the Father. We see this a lot when Bach sets this text. I think of the Domini Deus duet in the B minor Mass, which is soprano tenor. And there's this sense of following, and a different person is leading always, and who comes first, the Son or the Father, and this sort of the Son chasing the Father. We get this same idea in this duet, voices in canon in that way following each other. And we go on now to the fifth movement, which is the tenor aria, Quoniam, another sort of almost erratic, crazy transformation that he does here. This comes from Cantata 179, which is the same cantata that was the first cantata parried in the Kyrie. And this is the cantata that's about warning of hypocrites and having a false heart. In the tenor aria, the text is falsche Heuchelei Ebenbild, images of false hypocrites. And it shows hypocrisy with this sort of really bright, attractive glitter on the surface. It makes it incredibly appealing. But if you dig deep, inside it's filled with rot and nastiness inside. And I think that when you hear the opening lines of the tune, which we heard in the Mass on just oboe, and this is all of the first violin section with two oboes together, and it has this sort of outward splendor in a way, it dazzles. But the middle voices, the second violin and the viola, have all kinds of dissonance, and so does the continuo line, and I think it's representing the rot or the soiled state of what is inside the hypocrite. So listen to the beginning of this aria, which is wildly different than what we hear in the tenor aria from the Mass. And as you hear, the tenor is at the top of his range, and it's like, wailing sounds at the top of this, showing the false hypocrite. Do you want to say anything about that before I go on? Now, how does he transform into the Mass? I find it's almost unrecognizable, even though it's all the same music. He takes away the inner strings. He takes away all the strings, and we have one solo oboe and a continuo line. Immediately, there's an emptiness to it, almost a solitude to it. And he marks the biggest change in there as he marks adagio, which Bach seldom wrote anything for tempo markings. It's rare that we see an actual tempo marking from Bach. And so when Bach does write that, I always think, okay, this is intentional, this means something, let's unpack this. And the text, the Quoniam tu solo, for you alone are holy, you alone are the Lord, you are one of the Most High. And we slow this down and you hear the you alone, the solitude, the loneliness of this. So the glitter and jaggedness of that obbligato line played by the two oboes and violin are suddenly, and it's driving, they're transformed in almost these, sometimes it's searching. I feel like the oboe's looking for something, looking for that faith, that the one that is going to save him. And it's also, I feel like these streams of mercy The previous movement, the soprano and alto, asked, have mercy on me, have mercy on me. And we hear, I think, in the oboe, the streams of mercy that are flowing down.
It is an interesting transformation, and quoniam, this part of the Gloria, tends to be a very triumphant part of the Gloria. This aria, I think, doesn't really signal that. I agree. The searching, the sort of yearning in the music is really striking. Certainly quite different than the cantata, but there's a melancholy to it, which I think is fascinating. Why would these words be set this way? This leads us to one of the biggest issues that performers face when they work with, well, any music, but certainly the music of Bach, which is, where do we find the meaning? Do we look to the text and say, well, the text is saying this, so we must hear that in the music? Or do we listen to the music and let ourselves hear an emotion that seems recognizable and clear, and then ask the question, how does that emotion kind of sit and interact with the text? This is a debate that we have all the time when we work with the cantatas with the libretti that Bach set originally. But in this case, I think the ambiguity is very hard to reconcile. And Bach is being so deliberate about choosing this music to put onto this Latin text. I don't know what to make of it. But I also think that I mentioned earlier that the Latin text potentially for Bach was a more abstract concept. He clearly is reacting to the imagery in these various sections of the Mass, and Miserere nobis, et cetera, Gloria. But here, he has a way of. I think this solus. You talked about the loneliness. Is God lonely up there in heaven all by himself? I don't know. Does Bach think he is? But maybe that is the key that creates this sort of compellingly desolate mood. There is something also a little mystical about it, especially later in the aria when the tenor over and over again gets to his highest note on the word altissimus. So we have word painting in that case.
One final thing I'll say about this, Pam, you mentioned that the Latin text is more abstract, which makes complete sense, because if you compare another setting of this exact same text, the B minor Mass, the great bass aria with horn and bassoons, bum, bum, dee, has this sort of triumphant, heroic affect to it, which I don't know how do you square that with, if he's really responding to the text, how do we get two settings that are so wildly different? And I think there is the abstract nature of it that allows him to seek for meaning musically as opposed to in the text, which is what he has to do in the cantatas.
I'm just going to throw one last thing in there. If you do come to the showcase concert tomorrow night, we have two other movements from the other two Masses, the A major Mass and the G minor Mass. They both begin Qui tollis. But the second one includes the quoniam text, and he uses that as an excuse to change tempo. Of course, he has a model that also has this music in it, but here the quoniam is sort of the joy of recognizing God after having asked for the mercy that the Miserere nobis text does. So you will hear two examples of more Mass contrafactum in the concert on Sunday.
And this takes us to the closing movement of the Mass, the Cum Sancto Spiritu. The model for this is Cantata 17, Wer Dank opfert, preiset. We give thanks and praise. And it's a cantata from 1726, which, if you're tracking the years of Bach's Jahrgang, you would say, oh, that's the fourth. But indeed, the third Jahrgang kind of envelops 2 years. when he puts it together at the end. But comes from his third big cycle in Leipzig. And this is essentially a opening chorus of praise, and has this very long, did I mention it was a long instrumental ritornello to begin the cantata. This would be the opening chorus. Just listen briefly to at least the ritornello. So this goes on for a while. Choir comes in. Almost a minute into the piece. We still haven't heard the choir yet. It's coming soon. So, a fugue subject, the tenor started. For the cum sancto, he does a few things that are very interesting. The first, well, actually, I'm just going to play it. So I want to just talk about that. So we haven't heard this, right? This is the only 6 measures of newly composed music in the entire Mass. He uses for this text, Cum Sancto Spiritu, and it's a 6-measure intro that has, to my ear, a almost early 18th century, late 17th century Italianate style. I feel like it could almost be the music of Antonio Lotti or Pergolesi or Bononcini or something like that.
I intuited the model when I heard it this morning. The Vivaldi Gloria, Gratias agimus tibi, which is exactly the same length. And it's just these it doesn't have that beautiful pulsing accompaniment, but it's, Gratias agimus. It's like, this is Vivaldi. That's where I think he got it from.
So after he does this 6-measure intro of newly composed music, it immediately changes meter. We've been in 4/4, it changes into 3/4. The tempo doubles essentially, and we get the In Gloria Dei Patris that leads us into the fugue subject, which was the that. Then we get to, instead, it's on the text, Cum Sancto Spiritu in Gloria, etc. The only other big change he makes is so there's no instrumental ritornello. That's gone. We're transposed the key from A to G major, so it goes down a whole step to keep us in the big key of the Mass. And at the end of each fugal subject, there are these little choral interjections that serve as punctuation to end a sentence, where they come in 4-voice block, In Gloria Dei Patris. The other thing I will say about this movement that I find, and I was talking to Michael Beatty, our principal keyboard player and artistic administrator, about this, that this was, in rehearsal, the movement that I spent the least amount of time on. Part of it I was running out of time. But the other part of it is that the counterpoint is so straightforward and simple, as opposed to when we looked at the Gloria, the Laudamus Te, the complexity, the busyness, had to work really hard to adjust balances. This is incredibly straightforward. There are clear episodic materials. I almost feel like this could be a student piece or a teaching piece about how to do very straightforward and simple counterpoint.
What I kept noticing about the piece in listening to it is that it reminds me almost as much of the Cum Sancto Spiritu in the B minor Mass as it does of Cantata 17. Even though all the music is coming from Cantata 17, those punctuated choral Cum Sancto Spiritu in Gloria Dei, if you think of the B minor Mass's spectacular fugue that he writes at the end of it's the last movement of the music that he presented in Dresden. So it was like his big finale. And I mentioned earlier that I feel like the writing of that piece really kind of whetted his appetite to do more of this type of writing. And I feel it's almost like, I don't want to call it a double parody, because obviously it's not a parody of the Cum Sancto, but he's using so many structural elements from that Cum Sancto. These are the same words, right? Another thing that is an interesting thing to reflect upon, when Bach was writing cantatas in the 1720s, he wasn't concerned about ending in the same key that he started in. It wasn't like a something in this key, cantata in D major, right? But here in the Mass, he does seem very concerned with the integrity of the key throughout, whether this is something that is coming into the vocabulary of music in general as we're moving later in the 18th century, or whether it's just something that Bach himself started to think about. The fact that you mentioned that he transposes it down to G, he didn't have to. There was no law that said that the Mass had to end in the same key that it started in. And did he even title it Mass in G major, or just, Missa, right? But in fact, we do see him organizing these movements much more with an eye, or, an ear for key relationships and returning.
To the issue of key, he could have easily dispensed with this six-measure introduction that he does and kept the key in A major, because the previous aria ends in E minor. It would have been easy it would almost been inevitable that now we go to A. But he specifically goes from E minor, starts this newly composed six-measure intro in C, which is the subdominant of the major key, and leads us to it. The other thing, to your point about the similarities between this and the Cum Sancto Spiritu of the B minor Mass, is that the form is similar with these big choral interjections, and then just like in the B minor Mass, it's the tenors that get the opening. The range couldn't be more different, though. In the B minor Mass, the tenors are up at the top of their range. Cum Sancto Spiritu. They start on an E and have to pop out this high A on the second note. In this one, they start at the bottom of their range. Cum Sam. And it's, almost a whole, it's more than an octave. It's an octave plus. But it does start with the exact same interval as well. And we get these long melismas that are supported by the singers in an almost instrumental way. In fact, a lot of what we were doing in rehearsal, especially with the basses, I was saying, sing this more instrumentally, and getting the singers to get away from notes and think more instrumentally, to make room for the fugal subject to be able to have presence and sparkle. So I'm going to pick up in the recording of this opening six-measure sort of invocation that he writes, and you'll hear the transition and how the fugue subject comes in. Then the altos get the subject. You have to come tomorrow to hear the rest of it. To kind of, and I know Pam has some closing thoughts as well, but going through this for me was very interesting and begged the question, if this was a piece that was never performed that we know of, there's no evidence at least in Bach's lifetime, what was the objective of this endeavor? And when you talk about speculation, of which I have plenty, I speculate I think it's important to look at there are four of these short masses. They're not really Missa Brevis. A Missa Brevis is all of the Mass text in kind of toppled onto on top of each other and is very short. This is just, these are Kyrie Gloria masses, just the first two parts of it. If you look at all four of them and look at them as a compendium of the stylistic tools that Bach had at his disposal, I almost feel like this is his way of documenting what it was that he could do. It was almost Bach's way of cataloging all the different styles in which he could write and the prime examples of them, and giving them a Latin text which would be more widely disseminated beyond Lutheran Saxony and might have the chance, I almost feel like he was speaking to us, giving us, this is the possibility, and hoping this was going to go beyond the work of his Lutheran cantatas. And to Pam's point, there is a sense of increased accessibility when he gets rid of the, when he frees himself from the German text and from the biblical references and some of the inflammatory texts that are inherent in these Lutheran cantatas, when he puts them in this abstract universal language of Latin, I think it frees him up and also frees up his listeners to have the opportunity to enjoy these works.
So that gives me several threads that I want to pull on. One is this thing that I think many people who love Bach have seen, which is at the end of his life, he was being very sort of comprehensive in how he was putting together examples and sets of things that had a certain completeness. Many of them were in sixes, right? You know, 6 Brandenburg concertos, six sonatas and partitas, 6 cello suites seemed to be a significant number for him. I think it's a little odd that there are only 4 masses. You add the B minor to it, it's 5. It's still not 6. But this being end of the 1730s is a bit early for him to start. You know, the Art of the Fugue is one of those places where he's really saying, I have a legacy. It's not about a performance that's about to happen, but he really does seem to be thinking about posterity, about what people after his death will know of his works and will regard him for. So I agree that I think these masses are a sort of an early way for him to start to think about how do I speak in this genre or in this type of piece. So now I just want to start by sharing some of the debates that swirl around the existence of these works and take that into my conclusion. There have been some speculations that a certain Bohemian nobleman named František von Spork, who was a kind of a free thinker and spent some time in Leipzig, that some people have been very drawn to the idea that Bach perhaps wrote these pieces for him, or that kind of with him in mind, someone, I even read in one of the speculative, there's that word again, that perhaps it was a way for Bach to sort of surreptitiously share some Lutheran ideas, hiding them under the Latin text for this guy who was a Catholic but sort of was interested, you know, Lutheran curious, you know. And then you turn the page and you look at another scholar and they say, oh, this is so flimsy, this is no, absolutely not. So I want to move this into a more serious and more sort of a strong statement about what we do here at Emmanuel. I have colleagues and I've had people very, with great respect, want to refer to me as a scholar. And I will immediately correct them. And I will say, I am not a scholar. And they're like, oh, you're being so modest. I'm like, no, you don't understand. The work of a scholar is very, very important and valuable in the whole field of music and understanding great works. A scholar, a musicologist, is going to spend a lifetime studying sources, reading about history, pulling information, looking at scores and manuscripts, comparing them. We need people to do this work. This is not what I do. This is not what my training is. I was a performer, and I believe that what we do as performers is we are interpreters. And the role of the interpreter is different than the role of the scholar. We need the scholars, but we have to do something they don't do, is that we have to make decisions, we have to make choices. And the choices that we make must be informed by the very best information that we can find. But music is a present tense art form. It only exists when it happens in sound. And present day human beings make the music. If we aren't able to find the meaning in the score and present it so that our listeners feel the power of that, then we have not done our job. And this, to me, is exactly what the mission of the Bach Institute is to show our fellows and to send them into the world as strong interpreters of Bach, to understand how to determine what the choices are, and then to choose what you are going to do with a particular performance. And I also want to say, to those of you whose engagement with music is not as a performer but as a listener, that you are also responsible to not only inform yourselves if you wish, if you want to know more, but I also think you need to demand of your performers that they give you performances that have meaning and that are expressive and that are moving. That you also don't just say, well, I guess if it's very historically informed, that must have been how it sounded, and I have to accommodate myself to that, right? I think that it is just as important that our listeners say, I want to love this music. I want you to give me a performance that is thrilling and is thought-provoking. And I feel there's no better way to conclude the work that we've done here at the Bach Institute than to lay that message out for all of us who love this music and believe in its ever-living presence. We'd be happy to take any questions, if there are any. We'll be delivering a microphone to you.
I have two questions based on your wide knowledge of not only all of Bach, but of the parody structures. One is, what does triple meter typically mean for Bach, just as a gross generalization? And the other is about this issue of these fast changes, say, in the euphonium, for example. Do you think they're, and not knowing what these masses were for and what his intention was, has it ever struck you that there might be an element of Bach simply strutting his stuff, his chops, kind of a snarkier version of the compendium of the world, of his stylistic world? And have you ever felt any of that or not?
I'll take the second question. Sorry, the second question about, is this Bach strutting his stuff, or, I think Bach, after 3 years in Leipzig, was not incredibly comfortable or thrilled with his employment situation. And he was always seeking for something different, but, and again, this is where my speculation would come in. At the same time, he had a pretty good deal and was comfortable and had a large family. And I think it was sometimes there might have been, and he received all this criticism about his style being too thorny, not accessible, too many notes, etc. And often I think what he's doing is showing, when he writes in the galant style, is, okay, you want popular music? I'll give you popular music, but I'm going to put meaning in it, and I'm going to make it complex, but you won't know it as a listener. I also know that when I think about what was happening in Dresden at the time, which is part of the reason that he did the B minor masses, there was this guy Zelenka there, who was a Catholic, who was getting all the work and all the notoriety in Dresden, writing masses in Latin and in a more popular style. So I do think there was a little bit of maybe these masses were like, you know, no, Zelenka, this is actually how you write a mass in Latin. And these are the tools I have, but this is what I can do. And there really was, you know, perhaps it was a little bit of strutting his stuff to show off what he was possible of. But I like to think there was also him leaving a legacy for all of us to enjoy and learn.
So I'll try to tackle your first question, which is really impossible to answer. What does triple meter mean? There's no doubt that almost all instrumental music in the 18th century is informed by dance forms. So we have many triple dances. We have, you know, the minuet, we have the sarabande, we have, you know, the gigue and other things that, you know, move quicker. So I think that if you swim in that water, it's sort of a natural thing that if you're choosing a duple or a triple meter, you're hearing some kind of apotheosis of a dance. But, you know, the other direction to go in, because dance is a very highly secular form, the other direction to go in is what they were doing in the Renaissance. You know, the perfection of the meter was the 3, because 3 was the divine number because of the Trinity. And so do you hear sort of celestial or divine concepts whenever something is in a 3? I think Bach did not shy away from that, but I would find it very limiting to sort of see Bach speaking God every time he writes in 3. I think that's going too far. So like I said, I don't think I have the answer to that question, and I would be surprised if anyone did. But I will say one other thing, which is that I do see when Bach juxtaposes a triple division of the beat with a duple division of the beat, that sometimes that is highly significant. In at least one instance, I would be willing, here the interpreter, not the scholar, I would be willing to say that Bach is speaking of the divine and the human in Jesus' nature by juxtaposing triples and duples. And in that case, the tendency of some 18th century practitioners of music to simplify by moving everything towards the triple, seeing a duple and saying it probably would have swung so that everything would line up. I think that's a mistake. I think that for Bach to actually have us hear those things clash is to remind us of those the duality of nature in the same piece. We have a piece on our concert tomorrow night that I think will speak some of that.
But you wouldn't say that, say, here that it feels like this page, like the triple meter is sunnier music.
Is which?
Sunnier.
Sunnier.
And I wondered about that. Just from
is being in triple a happy thing?
It can be. Yeah. Oh, well, it definitely is not I think we can't make a blanket statement like that, especially if we're looking at Baroque dance forms. Just that alone, look at the sarabande. I mean, that was a song of death, and it had this weighted second beat. That certainly was not certainly was not sunny, and it carried a lot of weight, and it could be melancholy. I think you can do many things in 3 that are in a different mode, a different key, a different color, that color the character of a piece more than just the meter.
Thank you. Well, hi. This might be also speculative, but I was wondering, with this us versus them, or even wanting to possibly convert the other side, to what extent would the 30 Years' War have been in the memory of these Saxon Lutherans?
Yeah, that's a great question. We heard something about that on Monday night when Professor Schulenberg was speaking to us. He did make reference to the fact that it was not that long ago. It would be in the memory at least of the previous generation, if not the present generation. I feel that Lutheran writing keeps it alive. So even if you're not remembering that people in your village were slaughtered, or forcibly converted, or whatever else, the sermons and the other theological writings would have continued to hammer home that sense that Lutherans are under threat.
Ryan, how do you as a conductor decide where to trill and where not to trill? Where you want your choir to trill and not to trill? Because when we were rehearsing the Mass this morning in the Kyrie, you were like, you're going to want to trill, but don't. And then we did trill in other movements, so curious how that decision-making happens.
Well, specifically in the Kyrie, because I was looking for ways that it was different from, and I think the text, in the cantata upon which it's based, about the hypocrites, the Heuchelei, that the trill was completely motivated by the text there, and Bach wrote it in. And I think it was notable that in this score, he doesn't write at least in the urtext that we have, there is not a trill there. And I also think it's he's writing in a Renaissance style, which would necessitate, to my ear, no trill. It wasn't something that was happening yet. But I also, then in the Gloria, I find the trills in there to be these sort of, the trill is always the result of the dissonance created from an appoggiatura, is in the Baroque. I'm oversimplifying, but that's the idea. There's the tension of an appoggiatura, which creates release, and that's when you get a trill. And in something like in the Gloria, there's a celestial sort of ebullience to it that I think motivates a trill. Sometimes I think it's based on what the text is telling you. Sometimes it's what the harmony is doing. Sometimes the lack of it can leave a barrenness. One of the things, Katerina, we talked about, there's an aria she's going to play tomorrow night. Tomorrow night? Yeah, it's tomorrow. I'm getting my days mixed up. Cantata 59, where we discovered that the trill was causing her to slow down, and it was causing the line not to move forward because of the tension created. That release made the line relax, and we wanted it to move forward. So there is, numerous treatises on what trills are supposed to be, how they should be. Apropos of Pam's point, as an interpreter and performer of the music and a practitioner of it, I'm looking to, a lot of it is what works. Did that answer it, kind of?
Could you make a general comment about the singability of this music by children, boy choirs? Obviously the melismas one asks about, but the whole first 5 minutes of this piece is incredibly complex. If I were learning it, I would have to spend an enormous amount of time mastering these lines and not being confused by everyone doing something different around me that didn't quite seem to fit, obviously.
So I'm going to take this one, and I think that, first of all, when we think of children making music and children, you know, the boys in Bach's Schule, the Thomas Schule, they were, this was all they did, right? You know, they were there, they did receive some liberal art education, or, you know, the basics, reading and writing, but they were there to be trained as musicians. And the experience that they were having would certainly, I mean, I don't think we can compare modern boy choirs in our culture with the skills that these children probably had. I would say that's the first thing. But to counterpose to that, it's also possible that maybe these performances were not stunning. that maybe there are instances where I was speaking a little bit earlier to someone about this, the fraught question that shockingly has not come up at all in this Bach Institute. Why are you playing on modern instruments, and how do you feel about the Baroque instruments, and aren't we supposed to hear Bach on Baroque instruments? I'm not going to answer that one right now, but I'm going to move into this, what about the voices, right? So if Bach was writing for unchanged boy voices, why do we do this music with adult mixed gender choirs or soloists? And I think that, unlike with other composers, I think it's very easy to look at what Bach puts on the page and say, could he have imagined something that was beyond the performance that he had, instead of tailoring his music so that it would really, really work for the performers he had? Was he reaching beyond? I would say easily yes. He was always reaching beyond maybe what it would immediately sound like that Sunday, but thinking what it could be, what I'd like it to be, what I'm hoping in the future there will be performing forces that can realize my vision.
I just want to bring the changes on that last point, Pam, which is both in my pathetic attempts to play Bach on the keyboard, and also from days, centuries ago, when I actually used to sing some of this music. He is indifferent to the limitations of the human voice. If you need to breathe, that's your problem. I have something in my mind, I have a form, I'm doing geometry, I'm doing mathematics. You will fit your fingers as best you can to execute these figures. I'm very sorry that they're not designed to do the music I'm writing for you. And ditto your voice. You know, it's not like Handel, who actually understood voices and wrote to make them sing beautifully. He's like, you'll figure it out.
Oh, I couldn't agree more with that. And I think that, you know, there are 2 points that I'm constantly making, and one is that I think Bach actuates the difficulty. He wants something to sound hard because he wants the listener to feel that. He wants to feel the effort. He doesn't want it to just be pretty and easy. And I also think that in terms of this is my argument against learning everything about how the music should sound from understanding the function of a Baroque bow, for instance, or the way a Baroque oboe shifts registers. Because I think that Bach is not necessarily saying, I'm going to exploit this aspect of my instrument, that he's making it hard for that instrument. It's also hard on the modern instrument. So in fact, he's indifferent, as you said, but challenging us to find the solution which pushes the performer towards something that I always think that we are basically tools for him to get his message across. And he's not almost ever writing something that says, here's your chance to show off. And you know, he wants to show off, but I don't think he's interested in helping a performer show off. So I absolutely agree with you that Bach is sort of categorically different. I like to call him his own genre. He's categorically different than his contemporaries, and partly for that reason.
So this is a comment on your sort of summation. Ansel Adams wrote books on how to take pictures and print them. And in his book on the print, he says the negative is like the score and the performance is like the print.
If you're not familiar with, I've heard this is an amazing thing. We don't see this so much now with digital photograph, I think, but the idea that the photographer can tweak the way that he develops the negative and create something completely different by, you know, changing the shading or the intensity and all sorts of other things. I think, you know, it's a visual art form. It's there, it exists, we look at it, we have emotional reactions to it. But music is so different. Music is much more like theater because it happens over time, it happens in real time, and it cannot exist unless you have human bodies doing it. Perhaps someday there'll be AI, but it still has to exist in time and somebody still has to make decisions about it, right? And I think, again, it's a tension. I'll just call it a tension between the continual push to try to get back to some idealized or imagined perfection of sound that could have been happening in the 18th century. You know, we could also say, you know, play in 50-degree freezing churches and only read by candlelight. You know, I mean, we can keep going in that direction. What's going to happen to the music when you can't read your notes? As opposed to saying, yes, we can't not necessarily, you know, put 5 double basses into the B minor mass because now we have orchestras where we have forces like that. That isn't going to help the music. We learn from that. We learn that a lighter texture and quicker tempos are helpful to this music. We've learned so much from the incredible work of the period instrument people. But I always worry when I feel that the results are more about this is what makes my instrument sound good than this is what's illuminating what the score is telling me. So I know I sound very reactionary when I say these things, but I don't mean to be in terms of dismissing. I want to challenge my counterparts in the Baroque world, in the historical performance world, to ask the same questions of their playing and of the music that we're asking here. And when they answer those questions in a way that moves me, I'm cheering them to the rafters. But I don't always hear it from them. I don't always hear the palette, the emotional scope from utter despair to, you know, wild exuberance that I feel the music is asking us to produce, and I feel challenged to the very highest degree to figure out how to do.
Two quick questions. One is you mentioned that one of these 4 masses, actually, you do have evidence that it had been performed. And my question is when and if we know why.
Off the top of my head, I can tell you which one it was. I know it was the A major mass, BWV 234, which you'll hear a movement from tomorrow night with the 2 flutes. I don't recall when or the why. Do you, off the top of my head?
So the when was 1738.
Okay.
But and it would have been in the Thomaskirche, it would have been in the service. No, I don't think that anyone can really answer the why, but you can answer the how, which is that it was used as the mass movements for that service.
Okay.
We know that usually the mass movements were chanted in a typical Lutheran service, except on feast days, sometimes they would have instrumental and choral music. So it would have been on a larger feast day celebration in the church year.
Okay. And question two, the examples that you were playing for us, were they all from one particular group or other groups, and which one or ones, so that I can go and dig them up for myself?
No, it was a wide variety, and intentionally so. I didn't want to show too much bias in any direction. There was some stuff from, and incidentally, they were all period orchestras, simply because there is only one or two modern instrument recordings of the Mass that I'm aware of, and neither of them I felt I wanted to play, shall we say. And I thought it was important to stay at the same pitch level. I didn't want to go back and forth between 415 and 440. So they're all on Baroque instruments, and it was accompanied, there's some of the Masaaki Suzuki from Bach-Legium, Japan, Ton Koopman from Amsterdam Baroque, there was one John Elliott Gardner, Rudolf Lutz, the Bach Stiftung, there was Raphael Pichon, the Pygmalion, and I think there was one Herwege in there as well. So a real smattering, intentionally so, just to confuse you. Thank you all. Come tomorrow night.